I never thought a cough could end a lifetime of sacrifice. My own son said my illness was terrifying his child. That was the day he decided I no longer belonged in his home. If you're new to my channel, please subscribe and tell me where you're watching from. My name is Thelma and I'm 68 years old. I've spent nearly my entire life in a small, quiet town in Ohio. The kind of place where neighbors still wave from their porches and the cashier at the grocery store remembers how you like your bread sliced. I raised my son here. I buried my husband here. And until very recently, I believed I would grow old here too, surrounded by family, in the same streets that held all my memories. After my husband passed away, I learned how to survive on my own. I downsized my life, stretched every dollar, and kept moving forward even as my body began to slow down. The cough didn't arrive all at once. At first, it came and went with the seasons. Then it stayed. Doctors called it chronic but manageable. Something that required patience, consistency, care. I followed every instruction. I took my medication on time. I avoided cold air. I learned to sleep propped up on pillows so I wouldn't wake in the night gasping for breath. When my son asked me to move in with him and his wife, I thought it was love calling me home. He said he worried about me being alone. He said his child should grow up knowing their grandmother, not just through pictures or holiday visits. I believed him. I sold what little furniture I had left, packed my life into boxes, and stepped into their guest room carrying hope and trust, convinced I was wanted. At first, I tried to earn my place quietly. I cooked when my hands allowed it. I folded laundry slowly and carefully. I watched my grandchild after school and listened to their stories as if they were the most important thing in the world. When my chest tightened, I excused myself. I stepped outside to cough so no one would be disturbed. I told myself this was what family did. Adjust, endure, make room for one another. But small things began to shift. My son stopped meeting my eyes when I spoke. His wife sighed loudly whenever I rested on the couch for too long. Conversations happened around me, never with me. When I coughed during dinner, the table fell into an uncomfortable silence that felt heavier than any argument. I apologized constantly, even though I had no control over what my body was doing. I learned to measure my breaths. I learned which rooms carried sound and which ones swallowed it. I learned how to move through the house without being noticed. And I learned something that hurt more than the illness itself, that being quiet does not always make you welcome. Sometimes it makes you invisible. The night everything changed, my cough was worse than usual. The air was dry and the medicine hadn't worked yet. I covered my mouth, pressed a pillow against my chest and tried to muffle the sound. My body shook with the effort. Still, I heard footsteps in the hallway. Then the door opened sharply. My son stood there, his face tight, his wife just behind him. From another room, I could hear my grandchild crying. My son didn't ask if I was all right. He didn't ask if I needed help. He said calmly but firmly that my coughing was scaring his child. He said it wasn't healthy. He said this couldn't go on. I tried to explain. I told him I was seeing a doctor, that it would pass, that I was being careful. The words felt small and weak as they left my mouth. His wife crossed her arms. She didn't say much, but she didn't have to. Her silence spoke clearly enough. Then my son said it. He said maybe it would be better if I stayed somewhere else. Somewhere equipped to handle these things. He said it was for the family. He said it would be temporary, but his eyes told me otherwise. In that moment, I understood something that took me years to fully accept. Love can change its tone without changing its words. And sometimes being sent away doesn't require anger or cruelty, just inconvenience. I sat there on the edge of my bed, my chest aching for more than one reason, realizing that the home I thought I belonged to had already decided it was done with me. I want you to understand who I was before that night, because I wasn't always the woman sitting on the edge of a bed, counting breaths and trying not to cough too loudly. I was a mother first. That role shaped nearly every decision I made. I raised my son right here in this same Ohio town, working long hours at a local insurance office after his father died unexpectedly while our boy was still in high school. There was no backup plan, no safety net. There was just me doing what needed to be done because there was no one else to do it. I remember every stage of his life with a clarity that still surprises me. The late nights I stayed awake helping him study because he wanted to be better than average. The weekends I gave up so I could drive him to practices, interviews, and part-time jobs. I never complained. I told myself that sacrifice was temporary, that love was permanent. When he graduated, when he got married, when he held his own child for the first time, I stood quietly in the background, proud, steady, and certain that every hard choice had been worth it. By the time I turned 68, my life had grown smaller, but it wasn't empty. I had my routines. Morning tea by the window. Short walks when my joints allowed it. Phone calls with old friends who remembered me as more than just someone's mother. I didn't see myself as fragile. Yes, but not weak. Moving in with my son was never meant to be permanent, at least not in my mind. I thought of it as a shared chapter, a season of being close again. He said he wanted to take care of me, and I believed him. I believed that the boy I raised still lived inside the man standing in front of me. I trusted that the values I taught him, respect, loyalty, responsibility, had stayed intact. Emotionally, I arrived hopeful. Nervous too, but hopeful. I told myself I would adapt. I wouldn't interfere. I would earn my place by being helpful and grateful. I didn't want to be a burden. That word haunted me long before anyone ever said it out loud. My relationship with my daughter-in-law was polite and careful, always measured. We never fought. We also never truly connected. She ran the household with efficiency and order, and I learned quickly to stay out of her way. Decisions were made fast, without discussion, and I was expected to adjust. I did, again and again. With my son, things were more complicated. He could be kind in small moments, bringing me water, checking on my prescriptions, but impatient in others. When I spoke about the past, he changed the subject. When I needed reassurance, he offered solutions instead of comfort. I told myself this was adulthood. That sons grow busy. That love simply changes shape with age. Still, there were moments when I felt the distance widening. He spoke about responsibility as if it were a weight he carried alone, forgetting how much had been carried for him. I sensed that my presence reminded him of things he didn't want to face. Aging, illness, obligations he hadn't planned for. I didn't confront it. I didn't demand space or recognition. I stayed quiet, believing patience would protect me. I truly thought that if I gave enough understanding, it would be returned in time. I didn't realize that, in their eyes, my role had already shifted. From mother to problem, from family to disruption. And I was still holding on to trust, even as it began to cost me everything. Life inside my son's house settled into a rhythm that looked calm from the outside but felt fragile from within. I woke early every morning, long before anyone else stirred. The quiet helped my breathing, and it gave me a few precious minutes to feel like myself again. I made my tea slowly, took my medication, and sat near the window where the first sunlight warmed my hands. Those moments belonged to me, and I guarded them carefully, knowing they might be the only part of the day that did. As the house came alive, my role shifted without anyone needing to say it out loud. I helped where I could. I packed lunches, wiped counters, and folded clothes with slow, deliberate movements. When my grandchild came home from school, I listened to stories about spelling tests and playground arguments. I smiled even when my chest felt tight, even when my body begged me to sit down. I didn't want to be seen as idle. I didn't want anyone to think I wasn't trying hard enough to earn my place. Managing my health became something I did quietly, almost secretly. I kept my inhaler tucked into my pocket and hid my cough drops deep in my purse so they wouldn't draw attention. When I felt a coughing spell coming on, I excused myself and stepped outside no matter the weather. Cold air made it worse, but embarrassment felt worse than pain. I learned how to endure without letting it show. The changes didn't arrive all at once. They crept in. If I asked a question, it was answered quickly without warmth. If I offered a suggestion, it was met with a polite nod and then ignored. My daughter-in-law began rearranging the kitchen, moving items higher up, farther away. She never said anything directly, but the message was clear enough. I was in the way. Even my grandchild started to respond differently. When I coughed, their eyes widened. Not with fear at first, but with uncertainty. They looked to their parents for cues. Children learn quickly what adults teach them, even without words. Soon I noticed the flinches. The small steps backward. The whispered questions that stopped when I entered the room. My son noticed too. Instead of reassuring his child, he watched me. I felt his patience thinning, his concerns slowly shifting from my well-being to the disruption my presence caused. He spoke to me in shorter sentences, often while looking at his phone. Our conversations became practical and brief. I was informed, not included. There were moments when I wanted to speak up. To say that I was trying. That I was following every doctor's instruction. That this cough did not define who I was. But every time I opened my mouth, I remembered how dependent I had become. This was their home. Their routines. Their comfort came first. I started eating my meals earlier alone, to avoid the strained silences at the table. I kept the television volume low so no one would complain. I closed my door even during the day, shrinking my world to a single room so the rest of the house could breathe easily. Looking back, the red flags were everywhere. The way my presence was tolerated, not welcomed. The way my illness turned into an inconvenience instead of a concern. The way respect faded quietly without confrontation or explanation. Still, I told myself this was temporary. Families struggle. People adjust. I believed that love, even when strained, would find its way back. I didn't realize that the patience I showed was being mistaken for permission. And while I tried to make myself smaller, the decision about my place in that house was already being made, without me. Before everything truly fell apart, I kept telling myself that what I was living through was normal. That this was simply how families adjusted when generations shared a roof. I convinced myself that discomfort was part of love, and that patience would smooth the rough edges. Each day followed a careful pattern I created to keep the peace. I woke before sunrise so no one would hear me cough in the early hours. I brewed my tea quietly, rinsed my cup right away, and wiped the counter even if I hadn't spilled a single drop. I wanted there to be no evidence that I had been there at all. After breakfast, I helped around the house in small, deliberate ways. I folded laundry slowly, mindful of my hands and my breathing. I swept the kitchen floor in sections so I could stop when my chest tightened. When my daughter-in-law passed by, I stepped aside instinctively, offering a small smile that was rarely returned. She never thanked me, but she never told me to stop either. I took that silence as permission to keep trying, as hope that effort might still earn acceptance. When my grandchild came home, I became careful in a different way. I listened more than I spoke. I laughed softly, never too loud. If I felt a cough rising, I turned my head away and covered my mouth quickly, apologizing even when no one complained. I didn't want my presence to feel heavy. I wanted to be the kind of grandmother children remember with warmth, not the one they associate with discomfort or disruption. My health required constant attention, but I learned to manage it around everyone else's needs. I scheduled my medications according to the household's routine so I wouldn't interrupt anything. I rested only when the house was empty. On difficult days, I told myself tomorrow would be better. I reminded myself that I was lucky to have family at all, even if the warmth I had expected wasn't always there. The disrespect didn't arrive loudly. It whispered. My opinions were acknowledged with nods and then quietly dismissed. Plans were made without asking whether I could manage the noise or the pace. My room was referred to as temporary, even months after I had moved in. Once I overheard my daughter-in-law on the phone, telling a friend that things were challenging with me around. She didn't say my name. He didn't need to. My son rarely defended me. When I caught his eye during those moments, he looked away. Not out of cruelty, I told myself, but out of exhaustion. I made excuses for him the way mothers often do, even when their children are grown. I told myself he was torn, that he was trying to balance too much. I never allowed myself to consider that he might have already chosen a side. Over time, I learned to sense tension before a single word was spoken. A look exchanged between them. A sigh when I entered the room. A pause when I coughed. The house felt smaller with every passing week, not because of its size but because patience was wearing thin. Still, I believed that if I remained calm and grateful, things would stabilize. I thought endurance was strength. I thought silence was maturity. I didn't realize that my quiet compliance was being mistaken for acceptance. By the time the real conflict arrived, I had already been shrinking for months, making myself easier to ignore, easier to move, easier to send away. And when my cough finally became the reason, they didn't see a mother struggling to breathe. They saw a problem they were ready to solve. That night began like so many others, quietly without warning. The air felt heavier than usual, dry and sharp in my lungs. I took my medicine before bed, sat upright longer than I normally did and waited, hoping it would be enough. I didn't want to disturb anyone. I never did. Sometime after midnight, the cough returned, stronger than before. It wasn't loud at first, just a tight pressure deep in my chest that refused to loosen. I pressed my hand against my ribs, reached blindly for water and tried to breathe through it. When that didn't work, I buried my face into the pillow, doing everything I could to keep the sound from escaping. My chest burned, my eyes filled with tears, and my body shook from the effort of holding it all in. Then I heard it, a small cry from the next room. My grandchild was awake. Before I could steady myself, the hallway light snapped on. Footsteps followed, quick and impatient. My bedroom door opened without a knock. My son stood there, already dressed, his face tight with irritation. His wife stood just behind him, arms crossed, her expression firm and unreadable. He didn't ask if I was all right. He didn't ask if I needed help. He said my coughing had woken the child. He said the sound was frightening them. He said they had been dealing with this for too long. His words were calm and measured, almost rehearsed, as if this conversation had already happened in his mind before he ever stepped into the hallway. I tried to explain. I told him it was a bad night. I told him I was doing everything I could, that I would see the doctor again, that I could change my routine, that I would be more careful. My voice trembled, not just from the coughing, but from the fear rising in my chest as I realized where this was going. That was when his wife spoke. She said it wasn't healthy for a child to live around sickness. She said the tension in the house was affecting everyone. She didn't raise her voice. He didn't need to. Her calmness made her words cut deeper. My son nodded slowly. Then he said it. He said maybe it was time for me to stay somewhere else. Somewhere equipped for people my age. Somewhere that could handle medical issues. He said it wasn't personal. He said it was about his family. I looked at him, searching his face for hesitation, for guilt, for any trace of the boy I had raised. I didn't find it. Instead, I saw relief, like saying the words out loud had lifted a burden he'd been carrying. I asked where I was supposed to go. He said there were places. He said they would help arrange it. He said it would be better for everyone. No one else spoke. No one questioned the decision. Even my grandchild had gone quiet again, as if the choice had already settled into the walls of the house. I sat there on the edge of my bed, my chest aching in ways no medicine could reach, and I understood something with painful clarity. This wasn't a conversation. It was a conclusion. My illness hadn't scared a child. It had inconvenienced adults. That was the moment I realized I was no longer family in their eyes. I was a problem they were ready to remove. After that night, nothing felt real anymore. I slept sitting up, fully dressed, as if I might be told to leave at any moment. My chest still hurt, but the deeper pain came from knowing I was no longer wanted. Morning arrived quietly, almost cruel in its normalcy. Sunlight slipped through the curtains, birds sang outside, and the house carried on as if nothing had happened, as if my world hadn't shifted overnight. No one spoke to me at breakfast. My son avoided the kitchen entirely. My daughter-in-law moved around me as if I were furniture that would soon be removed. I tried to eat, but my hands shook too much to keep the spoon steady. Every sound felt too loud, every small movement too noticeable. Even my own breathing felt like an accusation, a reminder that I was now the source of discomfort in their home. Later that day, my son finally sat across from me. He chose his words carefully, the way people do when they want to sound kind without being questioned. He said they had looked into options. He said there were nice places with medical staff and quiet rooms. He said it would be temporary, but he didn't say how long. He didn't ask what I wanted. He spoke as if the decision had already been signed and sealed. I nodded because I didn't know what else to do. I felt ashamed of my tears, of how quickly they came, of how my body betrayed me at the exact moment I needed strength. I wondered how a woman who had raised a family, who had held everything together through loss and hardship, could suddenly feel so small, so replaceable, so alone. I thought about arguing. I thought about reminding him of every sacrifice I had made, every sleepless night, every bill I stretched, every meal I skipped so he wouldn't have to. I thought about his father, gone too soon, and how I had carried both grief and responsibility without complaint. But the words stayed trapped in my chest. I was afraid that if I spoke I would lose the last piece of dignity I still had. The fear crept in slowly. Where would I go? What would happen to my things? My photographs, my memories, the routines that gave my days meaning. I had no home of my own anymore. No place that was truly mine. I had believed family meant safety, something solid to fall back on. Now I wasn't sure what it meant at all. At night, I lay awake listening to the sounds of the house. The muffled television, the laughter from another room, doors opening and closing without me. Life was moving forward and I was no longer part of it. I felt like a guest who had stayed too long, except I had never been invited to leave in the first place. Inside me, a quiet battle began. One part of me wanted to disappear, to accept whatever they decided and stop being a problem. The other part, The part that had survived widowhood, years of work and long stretches of silent struggle, refused to be erased. I didn't yet know what I would do, only that something inside me wasn't ready to give up. I had spent my whole life being patient. I had spent years being understanding. But lying there in the dark, breathing carefully, I realized something I could no longer ignore. Patience without respect is just another form of silence. And silence, I was beginning to understand, had already cost me far too much. When they finally told me the date, they used gentle voices as if kindness could soften what they were doing. My son said they had found a place not far away. He said it was clean, quiet, and designed for people with needs. He carefully avoided the word home. I noticed that immediately. Words matter, especially when you're being sent away. I packed slowly. Not because I had many things left, but because every item carried a piece of my life with it. A photograph of my husband in his work uniform, taken back when the future still felt wide open. A cookbook filled with notes in the margins from years of cooking for my son. What he liked, what he didn't, what I made when money was tight. A folded blanket I had kept since before he was born. No one offered to help. No one asked what I wanted to take. My leaving felt organized, efficient, and strangely impersonal. As I moved through the house, I began noticing details I had ignored before. Mail stacked neatly on the counter that I was no longer expected to touch. The file cabinet in the study that was always locked. The way my son handled bills and paperwork without ever asking for help, even during the years when money had been tight. I remembered conversations I had brushed aside, moments when I had signed papers without reading too closely because I trusted him. Trust is a powerful thing. It can protect you, or it can blind you. That night, sitting alone in my room surrounded by half-packed boxes, I reached into my purse and pulled out a small folder I had kept with me for years. Inside were documents I had never thrown away. Old statements. Property records. A will my husband and I had drafted long before his death, then quietly updated afterward. I hadn't kept those papers out of suspicion. I kept them out of habit. A woman who has lived long enough learns to protect herself, even when she doesn't expect to need to. As I looked through them, something settled in my chest. I realized there were parts of my life my son had forgotten, or never bothered to understand. Parts he assumed no longer mattered. He believed that because I was quiet I was powerless. Because I was sick I was finished. Because I depended on him for a place to sleep I had nothing left. He was wrong. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't argue or accuse. I let them hold on to their version of me. The frail woman with the cough, the inconvenience, the problem they were solving. Inside something shifted. I stopped asking why this was happening and started asking myself what I needed to do next. I began making calls quietly. Short conversations. Simple questions. I listened more than I spoke. I confirmed what I already suspected and learned what I didn't know. With each answer I felt steadier, more grounded, less afraid. For the first time since that night in the hallway I felt calm. They believed they were sending me away forever. They thought distance would erase me. They didn't know that being underestimated had always been my quiet advantage. And as I zipped my suitcase closed, I made a promise to myself. I would leave with dignity, but I would not leave unprepared. The morning I left, the house felt strangely peaceful. Not warm, just settled, as if a decision had finally been carried out and everyone could breathe again. My son drove. My daughter-in-law stayed home. She said it would be too emotional for the child to see me go. I understood what she really meant. Out of sight made things easier. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I sat in the passenger seat with my hands folded in my lap, breathing carefully, watching familiar streets pass by like pages turning in a book I had already read. My son talked about traffic, about work, about anything that kept him from acknowledging what was happening. I listened quietly and answered only when necessary. I wasn't angry anymore. Anger had burned itself out, leaving behind something steadier, something clear. The place they brought me to was clean and well organized. Neutral colors lined the walls. Voices were soft, measured. A sign near the entrance read Care Center instead of home. That detail stayed with me. The staff greeted me politely, professionally. They asked questions my own family never had, about my health, my comfort, my preferences. I answered honestly, surprised by how much it mattered to be asked at all. It felt unfamiliar and yet grounding to be seen again. When my son hugged me goodbye, it was brief and awkward, like an obligation fulfilled rather than a moment shared. He said this was for the best. He said I would be safer here. I nodded and let him believe that I agreed. When he turned to leave, he didn't look back. That was the moment everything changed. Not because I felt abandoned, but because I felt clear. In my small room, after the door closed and the quiet settled in, I unpacked only what I needed. I placed my things carefully, then sat on the edge of the bed and took out my phone. I made one call. Then another. Each conversation was calm, measured, purposeful. I wasn't reacting anymore. I wasn't scrambling. I was choosing. I decided I would stop explaining myself. I would stop waiting for permission. I would stop hoping they would suddenly remember who I was to them. Instead, I focused on what I could control. My health, my records, my voice. I scheduled appointments. I requested copies of documents. I asked questions I should have asked years ago. With every step, I felt as if I were reclaiming a piece of myself that had been quietly set aside. That cough, the one they used as a reason to erase me, didn't define my strength. It had slowed me down, yes. But it hadn't taken my mind. It hadn't taken my resolve. For the first time since being sent away, I wasn't surviving from one moment to the next. I was planning. And when I lay down that night, breathing carefully but steadily, I didn't feel like someone who had lost everything. I felt like someone who had finally decided to take it back. The confrontation didn't happen the way people imagine confrontations. There was no shouting, no slammed doors, no dramatic speeches. It happened in a quiet office with neutral walls and a long table that felt too wide for comfort. The air was still, almost careful. My son had agreed to meet me there after I told him I needed his help with some paperwork related to my care. On the phone, he sounded relieved, as if this were finally something simple he could do, something familiar, something he could manage. He arrived with his wife. That told me everything. They sat across from me, composed and confident, already prepared to explain things as if I were confused or overwhelmed. My son asked how I was settling in. His wife offered a tight smile and said she hoped the environment was helping my condition. I thanked them both. Kept my voice even. I let them feel comfortable. I let them believe they were still in control. Then I slid a folder across the table. At first, neither of them recognized what they were looking at. Old documents rarely look powerful until you understand what they mean. I watched their faces carefully as they read, confusion giving way to concern, concern hardening into something closer to panic. I didn't interrupt. I didn't rush them. I had waited long enough for this moment. I explained gently that there were things they had never asked me about. Accounts I had maintained quietly over the years. Decisions my husband and I had made together long ago, back when we assumed family would always mean loyalty and care. I clarified what my name was attached to, and what it wasn't. I clarified what could still be changed and what had already been set in place. My son tried to speak, his voice rising slightly, but I raised my hand. For the first time in years, he stopped. He listened. I told him I wasn't there to argue. I wasn't there to beg. I was there to be clear. I explained that sending me away without discussion had consequences. That removing me from their home did not remove my voice, my rights, or my agency. That treating me like a problem to be managed had forced me to protect myself in ways I had never wanted to. His wife shifted in her seat. She asked if all of this was really necessary. I looked at her and answered calmly, without anger or bitterness. Yes. It was necessary, because silence had been mistaken for weakness, and patience had been taken for permission. Necessary because respect had been forgotten. When I finished speaking, the room felt different. The air had changed. The balance had shifted. They were no longer looking at an elderly woman defined by a cough. They were looking at someone they had underestimated. And for the first time since that night in the hallway, they understood something clearly. Sending me away hadn't ended anything. It had only begun. The consequences didn't arrive all at once. They unfolded gradually, the way truth usually does. Quiet at first, then impossible to ignore. After that meeting, my son stopped calling me out of obligation and started calling out of fear. I could hear the change in his voice immediately. The certainty he once carried was gone, replaced by hesitation, by careful pauses where confidence used to be. What I had shown them couldn't be unseen. Within days, practical realities began to surface. Plans they had made without me started to unravel. Assumptions they had relied on quietly collapsed. I wasn't told everything right away, but I didn't need to be. I heard it in my son's silences, in the way he asked questions without asking them directly. He wanted reassurance. He wanted the control he had lost. He didn't get it. Legally, everything I had said was accurate. Morally, it was unavoidable. Decisions that had been made for me, about where I lived, what kind of future I was allowed, what place I held in the family, were now being reviewed. Not because I demanded revenge, but because I demanded recognition. Accountability doesn't always arrive with raised voices or dramatic scenes. Sometimes it arrives as paperwork, formal meetings, and long silences where confidence once lived. My daughter-in-law stopped speaking on my son's behalf. During follow-up conversations, she stayed quiet. The woman who once stood behind him in silent agreement now let him answer alone. Power shifts have a way of exposing loyalties, clearly and without mercy. I observed all of it from a distance. I didn't rush back into their lives. I didn't offer forgiveness or reassurance. I focused instead on my health, my peace, my independence. For the first time in months, my cough eased, not because it vanished but because the weight on my chest had lifted. Breathing comes easier when you're no longer apologizing for existing. The final shift came when my son asked to see me, not to manage something, not to fix a problem, but simply to talk. He said he hadn't understood. He said things had gotten out of hand. He said he never meant to hurt me. I listened. I didn't interrupt. And when he finished, I told him something simple and true. Intentions do not undo actions. Love is not proven by apologies offered after damage is done. It is proven by choices made before the damage ever begins. He left that conversation quieter than I had ever seen him. The people who once dismissed me were now forced to face a difficult truth. Removing me had not removed my influence. They had mistaken age for irrelevance, illness for weakness, and patience for permission. And slowly, uncomfortably, they were learning that they had been wrong. I didn't move back into my son's house. That was the first boundary I set, and it became the most important one. Winning didn't mean returning to a place where I had been diminished. It meant choosing a life where my presence didn't require permission, where I didn't have to shrink myself to be tolerated. I arranged a small apartment not far from the care center, close enough to my doctors, far enough to protect my peace. It wasn't large, but it was mine. I chose the curtains. I chose the chair by the window. I chose the quiet hours of my day. I rebuilt my routines slowly: morning tea, measured breaths, rest without guilt. My cough still came and went, but it no longer carried shame with it. It was simply part of my body, not a judgment of my worth. My son tried to repair what he had broken. He apologized more than once. He asked what he could do to make things right. I told him the truth, calmly and without bitterness. Accountability is not a performance. It's consistency. I told him that love requires presence before a crisis, not explanations afterward. He listened. Whether he truly understood would take time, but that was no longer my responsibility to manage. My daughter-in-law kept her distance. I accepted that. I wasn't seeking closeness anymore. I was seeking respect. And silence, when it no longer erased me, felt peaceful rather than painful. What mattered most was what I reclaimed inside myself. I felt steady again. Grounded. I felt seen by myself first. I handled my affairs carefully and clearly. I protected what needed protecting. I spoke when my voice mattered, and I stayed quiet when silence served me, not others. I learned that strength at this age doesn't look like force. It looks like choice. It looks like knowing when to walk away and when to stand firm. It looks like breathing through discomfort without surrendering your dignity. If there is one thing I know now, it is this: getting older does not make you smaller. Being dismissed does. And the moment you stop accepting dismissal, everything changes. I was sent away because my cough made them uncomfortable. I stayed away because I learned my value never depended on their comfort. At 68, I didn't lose my family. I found myself. If this story touched your heart, remember this: age does not take away your strength, and silence is never weakness. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is walk away with your dignity intact. Thank you for listening, and never forget your worth.